what's interesting about the last two I mentioned, judgment and character, is that they're the most difficult to learn. We don't know how to teach it. We know that they're learned, but it's a challenge to know how they're formed. The irony is, I've never seen a person derailed because of a lack of technical competence or business literacy. But boy, I've seen lots of people plateaued or derailed from positions because of a lack of judgment and character. Now, the second generalization I want to make is that to keep their organizations competitive, leaders must create a social architecture capable of generating intellectual capital. Now, incidentally, almost any design or social architecture will work if the people want it to work. So I'm less concerned about structure than I am about what leaders are doing to motivate people. The words intellectual capital are the most important here, because that has to do with know-how, it has to do with ideas, innovation, brain power. Those are the things that make the difference. So the brightest leaders are aware of that. So those are my two leadership propositions. Character to create and generate intellectual capital. And that's why leadership is also a very personal thing. Certain leaders are more capable of generating intellectual capital than others. To put it simply, whips and chains no longer work. We've got to think carefully about the qualities that make leaders effective. So I ask myself, what is it that people want from their leaders so that they will feel enthusiastic and inspired and energetic? And I've identified four characteristics or four qualities that people look for in their leaders. And what they are one, again, purpose or direction, and they also want meaning with that purpose and direction. They want leaders who can generate and sustain trust. They want leaders who have a sense of optimism, are purveyors of hope, and they want leaders who can attain and achieve results. So let's look at all four of those. Let's start with purpose. I can't exaggerate the significance of a strong determination to achieve a goal, a conviction, a passion, even a skewed distortion of reality that focuses on a particular point of view. And the leader has to express that in a variety of ways. I mentioned earlier about Michael Eisner and his point of view, and how people with a strong sense of purpose or point of view typically gain power. I mentioned Max Dupree, who said that the first task of a leader is to help define reality, which is another way of talking about purpose. But it can't be any old purpose that will galvanize and energize and enthrall people. It has to have meaning and resonance. My favorite illustration of meaning is a marvelous Peanuts cartoon featuring Lucy and Schroeder. Lucy's looking at Schroeder in her characteristic position, elbow on the piano, looking wistfully while Schroeder is playing the piano. In panel 2, Lucy asks Schroeder if he knows what love is. And Schroeder immediately stands up at attention, hands at his sides, and says, love, a noun, an attraction to or affiliation with a person or persons. On panel 3, he sits down and starts playing the piano again. On this panel, Lucy looks off reproachfully in the distance and says, on paper he's great. All the mission statements in the world, or most of them, suffer from the same thing. They look good on paper, but do they have the resonance? Do they have the meaning for the people that they're supposed to lead and inspire? The second is trust. Leaders generate and sustain trust. I needn't tell you how difficult that is today, in today's workplace, because we live in a world of temps, of not having the same compact with our employees as we used to. The kid growing up in the Depression, as I did, figured, well, I'll be successful if I just work hard, put one foot ahead of the next, get a job, and hold it. Well, that's not the case today. The trust factor is the social glue that keeps any act together. And remember, trust is easy to lose. and virtually impossible to gain. To trust other people, to have confidence in them, we need to see evidence of their competence. I once interviewed Hollywood producer and director Sidney Pollack. He's very highly respected and has such confidence in directing that he could get almost anybody to work with him on a movie. He never makes anybody feel wrong. We expect our leaders to be competent. And Sidney Pollack can get almost any actor in Hollywood to work with him because they know that he is so competent that the chances are very good if they work on one of his films, they'll have at least a chance at being nominated for an Academy Award. Another aspect of generating trust is openness. I can't overemphasize the importance of encouraging openness, even dissent. I once received a letter from an executive who wrote, "We've got thousands of folks, union workers and others, who want the world to be the way it used to be, and they are very unwilling to accept any alternative forecast of the future." The problem is, there's no trust in his organization. That executive was an old-fashioned control and command type, sort of a controlosaurus who never could regenerate the trust among his key stakeholders. The union members were not the problem in this case. The problem was people didn't trust him. Now, one of the best ways to build trust is by deep listening. It's the most powerful dynamic of human interaction when people feel they're being heard. Listening doesn't mean agreeing, but it does mean having the empathic reach to understand the other. The third is optimism. Almost all the executives believe that they can achieve their goals and have a happy outcome. Now, in a strange way, I would call this a distorted perception of reality, because I was taught in graduate school to think that the major criterion of mental health was an accurate perception of reality. But I sense that many of these terrific leaders perceive that they can really change the world. So they're purveyors of hope. Their optimism fascinates me because it is so pervasive and so powerful. And I don't think it can be built on phony grounds. A marvelous story about former President Reagan comes from his pollster, Richard Worthland, who was Reagan's pollster and surveyor for about 7 years. Now, one of Reagan's strengths, we all know, was how well he could convey that sense of optimism, which at times was very badly needed. And Worthland told me that in 1982, when we were still in an economic decline and recession, Reagan's approval rating dropped to about 32%, the lowest on record for any president in the second year of office. A year or so earlier, shortly after the attempted assassination on his life, his approval rating was off the charts, up in the low 90s. Reagan said, "Okay, Dick, tell me the news." And Worthland said, "It's not very good, Mr. President." And Reagan said, "Well, what do you mean?" And Worthland said, "Well, it's 32%. The worst it's been for any president in the second year in office." To my amazement, Worthland told me, Reagan began smiling and said, Dick, for goodness sake, stop worrying. I'll just go out there and try to get shot again." That's what you call optimism. Fourth is getting action and results. The last quality common to leaders is a bias toward action, the capacity to convert purpose and vision into action. You can have the best vision in the world, generate a lot of trust, have a lot of optimism, but unless you can execute, it means nothing. It's got to be manifest in some external products and results. Most leaders, as I've said, are pragmatic dreamers or practical idealists, if that's not too much of an oxymoron. They step up to the plate and they take their shots every day, perhaps knowing what hockey player and philosopher, the great one, Wayne Gretzky, once said, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take." Now, those are some of the things that stand out as I talk to leaders. And I think these are the things people look for in leaders.
Understanding the crisis of leadership and the qualities that make for effective leadership, Dr. Bennis has some guidelines for the development of the leaders.
The question then becomes, how do we develop such leaders in our organizations? Well, here are some simple guidelines for developing leaders. First, identify those individuals who grow leaders. Who are the great mentors and great coaches? Many people are simply terrific at giving birth to leaders. They're good coaches. Identify them and then reward them. When I chaired the search committee for our new president of the University of Southern California, we looked for a person with more people who had worked under him who went on to become university presidents. We wanted to see if we could identify a leader grower. But rarely are these people rewarded if ever identified. So find out who the good coaches are and reward them. Second, make sure the organization identifies what are the key developmental experiences to forge leaders. What are the things that actually produce good leaders? For example, one recipe for developing leadership is to appoint a person to head up an important task force within a certain time frame, with a highly significant, not peripheral problem, but one that is salient and is important to the company, and put it under careful top management scrutiny, where that individual has in the task force members of different parts of the organization with whom he or she has no hierarchical relationship. The companies that I know of that are terrific at growing leaders also believe in cross-functional experience. They have to be all around the organization before they get to the top. In America, we have a lot of upward mobility. In Japan, I've noticed they have a lot of horizontal mobility, getting people to know the organization almost as a complicated kaleidoscopic, almost like a prism where they can see all the angles, all the edges, all the curves. Third thing is, the more bosses you know and you work under, the better. The more the merrier, because people learn as much from bad bosses, perhaps even more, as they do from good bosses. They learn from bosses with extreme talents. Sometimes it could be of an even ogreish kind, or it could be a terrific kind. Organizations must develop a menu of developmental experiences which would encourage the growth of leadership. For example, for new employees, challenging first jobs would be terribly important, but usually new employees are put into boring positions. I would think that in mid-career, another set of developmental experiences would be necessary, such as an advanced management program at some university. And at the senior level, yet another set of developmental experiences will have to be created. Another point, encourage managers to surrender the people who are terrific in their jobs and permit broadening experiences for them. I've seen all too often when a person has a terrific subordinate to not want to have that person leave, even at the risk of that person's growth.
Personal introspection also plays a critical role in the development of a leader.
Know thyself, said the inscription over the oracle at Delphi, and it is still the most difficult task any of us faces. But until you truly know yourself, strengths and weaknesses, know what you want to do and why you want to do it, you cannot succeed in any but the most superficial sense of the word. Leaders never lie to themselves, especially about themselves. They know their flaws as well as their assets and deal with them directly. You are your own raw material. When you know what you consist of and what you want to make of it, then you can invent yourself. I would argue that more leaders have been made by accident, circumstance, sheer grit, or will than have ever been made by all the leadership courses put together. Leadership courses can only teach skill sets. They can't teach character or even vision. And indeed, they don't even try. Developing character and vision is the way leaders invent themselves.
In focusing on leaders, Dr. Bennis points out that we can't lose sight of the followers.
It is probably inevitable that a society as star-struck as ours should focus on leaders in analyzing why organizations succeed or fail. As a longtime student and teacher of management, I, too, have tended to look at the men and women at the top for clues on how organizations achieve and maintain institutional health. But the longer I study and examine effective leaders, the more I'm persuaded of the underappreciated importance of effective followers. What makes a good follower? The single most important characteristic may well be a willingness to tell the truth. In a world of growing complexity, leaders are increasingly dependent on their direct reports, on their subordinates for good information, whether the leaders want to hear it or not. Followers who tell the truth and leaders who listen to it are an unbeatable combination. Movie mogul Samuel Goldwyn seems to have had a gut-level awareness of the importance of what I call effective backtalk from subordinates. After a string of box office flops, Goldwyn called his staff together at an off-site meeting in Palm Springs and told them, "I want you to tell me exactly what's wrong with me and MGM, even if it means losing your job." Now, although Goldwyn wasn't personally ready to give up the ego-massaging presence of yes-men, in his own gloriously garbled way, he acknowledged the greater need for staff that speaks the truth. Like portfolios, organizations benefit from diversity. Effective leaders resist the urge to people their staffs only with others who look or sound or think just like themselves, what I call the doppelganger or ghostly double effect. Doppelganger, a German word which conveys that notion of twinship, of that ghostly double. They look for good people from many molds, and then they encourage them to speak out, even to disagree. Aware of the pitfalls of institutional unanimity, some leaders wisely build dissent into their decision-making process. Effective leaders reward dissent as well as encourage it. They understand that whatever momentary discomfort they experience as a result of being told from time to time that they are wrong is more than offset by the fact that reflective backtalk increases ability to make good decisions. Executive compensation should go far towards salving the pricked ego of the leader whose followers speak their minds. But then you have to ask yourself, what's in it for the follower? The good follower may indeed have to put his or her job on the line in the course of speaking up. But consider the price he or she pays for silence. What job is worth the enormous psychiatric cost of following a leader who values loyalty in the narrowest sense, who values loyalty in the absence of truth? Perhaps the ultimate irony is that the follower who is willing to speak out shows precisely the kind of initiative that leadership is made of.
Changing leadership, according to Dr. Bennis, also equates to changes in the organization.
One way leaders release the brain power and creativity of people is to create effective forms of organization. MasterCard International is evolving into a federation where decisions are made by the units that can best make them. The only reason for decisions to get made at the top is when the matter to be decided is something that relates to everybody, or you need some sort of synergy among the units. We need to think of new forms, and federation is one of the best in terms of its potential to accommodate the nature of global business. Over 30 years ago, I thought rigid, pyramidal, hierarchical organizations were doomed, largely for theoretical reasons. Now I see that they are doomed because they simply don't work, or more precisely, because they don't work fast enough. Today's most viable institutions are dancers. They're not marchers. All effective leaders reinvent themselves as they go along. True leaders are constant learners. They hunger for knowledge. They learn from every position, and they grow both in knowledge and in character. They learn from mistakes, become effective. In a sense, most successful people reinvent themselves through continuous learning. Successful leaders recognize that we're moving to a stage of idea-intensive production and away from material-intensive production. They realize that success comes through intellectual capital that creates wealth, and that people with ideas are going to make the difference. What leaders offer is intellectual capital, ideas, know-how. They create a learning environment, an adaptive, agile, athletic, a social architecture capable of generating intellectual capital. Great leaders are concerned with people and dollars and ideas. Those three things. If they pick the right people, allocate the right number of dollars to particular divisions, break down the bureaucratic roles so the best practices get transferred immediately from one division to the next, then we're going to see successful corporations. Successful corporations will not be content to rest on their past progress or past success. They will change, reorganize, revitalize, and reinvent themselves without being forced to. If a leader wants to retain the best and the brightest, if he or she wants a company that has its foundation in ideas, innovation, and learning, that leader's got to be the coach. The coach who gets people to play at their best, who brings out the best of their ideas.
Dr. Bennis also identifies changes that he feels are necessary in the role provided by the business schools.
I want to say a few words about business schools. Last year, 95,000 MBAs were graduated from our business schools in this country alone. Now, by and large, business schools have done a fairly good job, and one of the healthiest things about business schools right now, including the very best ones, is that they're re-examining their curriculum, their faculty, the way things are taught, so that they're going to keep ahead of the practice of management so they can still impart their wisdom to the practitioner. So while business schools are doing a creditable job, there are at least 4 ways in which I think they can make vast improvements on their present offerings. And I speak as a professor at the University of Southern California Business School. First is critical thinking. I guess this comes as a consequence of having a quality liberal arts education, which I had. Learning what systemic thinking is all about. How to make connections. How to make sense of the world. Why shouldn't we at business schools offer courses in the great books on Machiavelli, on Hobbes, on Hegel, and Marx, or Tolstoy? To not read these authors and books is to not understand love, passion, power, and what it means to be human. Second is social emotional skills, people skills. When I talk to alumni, business schools, they often say they want more leadership, they want more interpersonal communication skills, and more writing skills and communication in their business education, which they didn't get. And they want to learn more about themselves, their presentation of self. This is what our business students tell us they didn't get when they went to school. Third, the idea of an extended family. Along with virtual corporations, we really need to create virtual universities. This is just now beginning. We have the technology now to beam in on the best faculty from Stockholm, from Fontainebleau, from Tokyo, from Berlin, to create a virtual university or invisible college, a group of colleagues, an intellectual community with whom we can communicate, external and apart from our own universities. And finally, and fourthly, related work experience. Consider a model where no student enters graduate school right out of college. Only after at least 5-6 years of work experience. And they're sent there to business school and supported by their companies. And they study for no more than a half year, and they work the rest of the year. So it takes them 3 or 4 years to complete their MBA. We really need fresh thinking. The quality of American education system has declined greatly. K through 12 system is in a shambles. Our education system is a receptacle for all our social ills. Now we have a 19th century educational delivery system trying to serve the needs of what will soon be the 21st century. The only answers will come from experimentation and from involvement at the K through 12 level of parents. We also need and have to pay for creative teachers and administrators who work to involve the parents rather than to simply defend the status quo. We need to examine what we're doing right in our colleges and apply what we can to the K through 12 system. Like so many things in life, the problem in education isn't money or a lack of caring. The problem is a lack of leadership. We must come to a shared vision on education, government, business, industry. We must select good leaders, and we must give them a chance to lead.
After a long day in the studio recording all of the preceding material on these two cassettes, Dr. Bennis was asked if he had any final words of wisdom or guidance with which he would like to leave the listeners.
The most important thing I could say for once and future leaders is that they should take very seriously the old Socratic dictum, know thyself. It seems to me once you know who you are, what you stand for, what your compelling beliefs are, and then create opportunities to deploy those talents, I think the first and most important step of leadership is taken. So, just to repeat a little bit, try to identify your own module of genius and then create opportunities where you can practice and then deploy that to not only fulfill yourself, but to create healthy, productive organizations.